Okay, those are some ways and some things that you can do to put your garden to bed for winter. But let me tell you why. You may not even need to put your garden to sleep for winter at all. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to my garden. My name's Vanessa, and I turn our yard into our own little happy place at home here in Zone 7B, Virginia. And I want to give you whatever tools I have to help you do the same. Today, let's talk about getting the garden ready for winter. There are a bunch of things that you could do to get your garden ready for winter, really. Some of them are optional, some are essential, while others are even controversial. I will cover one that is optional, two that are essential in my opinion, and I'll give you my thoughts on one last one that is controversial, and I'll do it in that order. But make sure you stick around to the end because then I will explain why you may not even need to put your garden to sleep for winter at all. The first thing you should do to prepare your garden for winter is to divide perennials, at least the ones that you want divided. This one is optional because it's not super time sensitive. It is best if you do it in the fall, but if you miss that window, you can do it in the late winter, early spring. Generally, it's recommended that you divide perennials every 3 to 5 years. You'd want to divide your perennials for 3 reasons. The first is to prevent overcrowding. If your plant has gotten larger and larger each year in its spot, then it could start to crowd out other plants or the whole garden bed in general. And you do want to maintain some aspect of airflow in your garden beds. The second reason is to promote healthy growth of the plant. Some perennials, when they get too large, they start to die out in the center and may even become less vigorous, which is interesting, right? So you want to divide them to keep them at an optimal size for best performance overall in the garden. Another reason you would want to divide perennials is to propagate your plants. You may have a plant that you want more of, and the best way to do this is to dig it up, divide it, and move it around your garden. I bought one Walker's Low catnip plant like 3 or 4 years ago, and I've been dividing it since. It's like 20 plants now. And I don't think I've ever seen that catmint as a mature plant, like it could be not in my garden, because I always divide it. I had decided that this was going to be the year that I wasn't going to divide it until I remembered that I'm going to be moving it, or not moving it, but I'm going to be dividing it to put some of it in my front garden beds because I'll be redoing it to make it more deer resistant. The deer problem has gotten out of control in our neighborhood, and catmint is deer resistant. So maybe in 2026, I'll see that catmint as a mature plant. Okay, let's move on to the few winter planning items that I do feel are essential. I would call them essential only because if you miss the opportunity to do them now, then you won't really get a chance to do them later. You will kind of miss the boat. The first one is to mulch over things that are borderline hardy in your area. Let me explain. You may have some things planted in your garden that would come back in your garden if your winter temperatures were just 5 to 10 degrees warmer. If your winters are 5 to 10 degrees warmer, then you would be in a warmer USDA zone. So in Virginia, where I live, I'm in zone 7B. But if my temperatures were 5 to 10 degrees warmer, then I would be in zone 8A. There are plenty of plants that I have in my garden that are technically rated to come back at zone 8, but not my zone 7B. So to get them to come back, I fudge things a little bit by mulching those plants extra before winter comes so that I can keep them better insulated. In my garden, these are things like elephant ears, cannas, and a big one is dahlia. Dahlias are so beautiful, but they typically bloom closer to the end of summer if I started them at the normal time in spring. But if I can overwinter them in the ground, I'll give them a huge head start and they bloom a lot sooner for me than they otherwise would. My overwinter dahlias tend to bloom late May or at the latest early June. The way to do this is to simply find your plant, cut the stalks down to just maybe 1 or 2 inches above the ground. Leaving a little bit of the stalk above the ground ensures that you can find the plant later in spring. Once you've done that, do your best to insulate that plant. You can use leaves, you can use mulch. Some people even put down cardboard on top of them and then use leaves and mulch. You just want to do your best to try to keep it warmer than it would otherwise be. The third thing you want to do is to order your spring bulbs. Okay, spring bulbs are absolutely lovely, but by the time spring comes around, people are always wondering how do they get them in their garden. But the truth is that now, autumn is the time to get them in your garden because by the time spring comes around, you will have missed the boat. And these are flowers like crocuses, hyacinths, tulips, daffodils, alliums. Anemones and ranunculus are grown from what are called corms as opposed to bulbs, and honestly requires slightly different treatments from the typical spring bulbs. But if you have any interest at all in growing them, now is the time to purchase them because you may not be able to find them later. Another one worth thinking about that is slightly different from ornamental spring bulbs, but should be treated as such, is garlic. Now in fall is the time to plant garlic to ensure you have nice, big, beautiful heads of garlic come late spring or early summer. If you have a nursery near you that sells bulbs readily, go there and handpick them. I'd say this is preferred because then you can handpick the biggest and nicest bulbs. Otherwise, you'll just have to order them from an online source. You can plant these things as long as your ground can be worked. The fourth thing that I would recommend you do in fall is to do as much garden cleanup as possible. Under cleanup, I would add things like cutting back perennials, moving leaves, and tidy up as much as possible. This is controversial though, because some people are looking out for insects and critters like turtles and toads that need a place to overwinter. They argue that a lot of these critters use the leaves as a source for food and shelter. The caterpillars of a lot of butterflies overwinter in leaves. These same people also argue that some birds and insects need the seed heads from the perennials as a food source through the winter. People on the other side of this argument argue that while it is true that you can overwinter a lot of beneficial insects this way, bad insects also can be overwintered this way. If it's shelter enough for one, it's shelter for the others as well. Another sort of argument for leaving the garden up for spring is the apparent beauty that it provides in the winter. Some people argue that dead and brown plants are better to look at in the winter than a barren garden, and I don't know that they're wrong. There's a point to be made here. If your garden doesn't have enough greenery to anchor it in the winter, your garden will look empty without it. So it may be worth it for the sake of structure to leave your cleanup until spring. My opinion on all this is that while I don't agree that you should let the leaves fall wherever they fell on your lawn, I will encourage you to use the leaves in your garden as mulch because it will decompose and add a lot of richness to your garden soil. Also, I don't disagree with the effort to leave the rest of the garden plants up all winter. I would urge you, though, to consider your own capacity to clean up your garden. While we want to make the garden a refuge for all sorts of critters, we must not forget that we're also making the garden a refuge for ourselves. If it's too much for you to do the garden cleanup in the spring, do it when you can. And if that's fall, then so be it. Okay, those are some ways and some things that you can do to put your garden to bed for winter. But let me tell you why you may not even need to put your garden to sleep for winter at all. In my zone 7B, gardening doesn't stop because a freeze has come in autumn. I spend quite a bit of the winter still gardening because there are plenty of mild winter days here and the ground pretty much remains workable throughout most of the winter. If that was gibberish to you, let me explain. There are two reasons why you might be forced to stop gardening and therefore have to put your garden to sleep by late fall. If your winter days are harsh and the ground is not workable. If you're someone who walks around in flip-flops and shorts in the middle of winter, This may exclude you. But the rest of us all have a threshold for what we consider to be too cold for us to be working outside. To be able to garden in a place where it gets freezing cold, for example, you'd likely need bulky gloves. Mittens nor frozen hands are the most practical items with which to wield garden tools. But even that reason is subjective, really, because, like I said, different people have different tolerances for cold. The most objective reason why you might put your shovel away for winter is because your ground freezes, something over which you have zero control. You may not know this because you're new to gardening, but in the winter, it's not just the air temperature that decreases, but the soil temperature decreases as well, down to even freezing in some places. When this happens, you can't even get your shovel through it. So there's no digging to be done. The ground is unworkable at this point. That's the term we use. In our zone 7, our ground hardly freezes. If it does, it might just be for a day or two, maybe a week at most, but it tends to return to being workable very quickly. And while we do see cold temperatures, our winters are generally mild. By mild, I mean that most of the winter days it's like in the low 30s, which is around like 0 degrees Celsius. So if you live in a zone that has similar winters or better than my zone 7, you can do these things to put your garden to bed in late fall, but you don't have. I do them. I just don't do them in late fall. I just do them throughout the winter. I move shrubs in the winter. I plant bulbs throughout the winter. I prune roses in the winter. I start seeds even in my garden in the winter. I do tend to be more sensible with my perennial divisions, and I divide them in the very late fall or the very early winter. Winter gardening does slow things down, but it's also an opportunity to regroup and see the garden bare bones so that I can make the appropriate changes I want for spring, summer, and fall. I have an entire video dedicated to designing your garden so that it is beautiful through all 4 seasons, especially in the winter. It's right up here. I don't want you to fall into the trap of having a garden that looks good all the time except for winter. I think it will help you. See you there.